Hitler had invaded Poland, World War II was underway, and the German armed forces desperately needed soldiers. Millions of young Germans had been drafted, including, as in the past, tens of thousands of men of Jewish descent.
Being a transport driver was a very brilliant job, there was no question.
Geert Falkenberg was part of the German forces that invaded France in 1940. His family, including his Jewish father, had fled to England. Did you ever think of deserting and trying to join them?
Probably I had the idea, but I couldn't do it. How? You know, Europe was fascistic.
So it was safer to just stay in the army?
Yeah, certainly. The safest thing was to stay in the army, no question.
In the German army, I was in a pretty good situation. People were not persecuted. It was a good bunch of guys. I felt comfortable there.
But if these soldiers felt safe, their Jewish family members did not. As historian Bryan Rigg found out, there were many complaints from soldiers about how their Jewish relatives were being treated at home.
Many of these men were coming home from the battlefronts, and they were finding that their families were being severely persecuted. You know, dad lost his job, mom was being spit on in the street. Many of these men went to their commanders and said, "Hey, look, I've served this country honorably, I have the Iron Cross, and look how they're treating my family."
It may have been due to those complaints, or it may be that Adolf Hitler simply decided he no longer wanted half-Jews in his army. Whatever the reason, in April 1940, Hitler ordered all of them expelled from the armed forces. And with his words, the idea that military service could protect the Mischling soldiers or their families instantly vanished. Now, the only lawful way to remain in the military was through a loophole offered by the Führer himself. In the Third Reich, it was actually possible to apply for a legal exemption from being Jewish. Partially Jewish soldiers flooded the Führer's office with applications, and remarkably, Hitler reviewed thousands of them personally. While the issue of exemptions has been known by historians for a long time, it was Bryan Rigg who brought to light the extent of Adolf Hitler's involvement.
Every application that came in, he wanted photographs, front and side shots of these men, because he wanted to see how they looked, you know, physically. Did they have a big nose, big ears, or did they have blonde hair and blue eyes?
Hitler actually wrote special permissions for individual soldiers?
He had his Secretary of State, you know, formulate the legal language, but then he would sign off on them. And these certificates basically said, you know, I, Adolf Hitler, declare you of German blood, according to the racial laws, and sign it.
And that's how a handful of men of Jewish descent were allowed to stay in uniform and even rise through the ranks. One even became a field marshal, the equivalent of a U.S. five-star general. Without an exemption, most of the so-called Mischlinge were kicked out of the armed services by the end of 1940. With the stroke of a pen, battlefield heroes had been marked for their eventual extermination. Geert Falkenberg never had a chance to apply for an exemption before it was too late. He was put up for promotion, but the paperwork that promotion triggered meant his secret, that his father was Jewish, would be discovered.
And I said, Captain so-and-so, please stop it. It's impossible. I am half Jewish, so I cannot become an officer. And it was too late already. He had done this.
How long after he put in your papers were you dismissed?
That went quick.
Those who couldn't get an exemption had to figure out how to beat the system or just hope they wouldn't be found out. Arno Spitz managed to get promoted, perhaps because he was such an accomplished soldier. Spitz, a paratrooper, won 3 medals for bravery and close combat, unusual for a man who, because of his Jewish father, could easily have been in a concentration camp instead of in the army. You were, by almost any standard, a first-rate soldier.
In my heart, I was not a soldier.
In your heart, you may not have been a soldier, but on the battlefield, you were a soldier.
Yes.
I sort of get the feeling that the Führer and those around him would have described you as a hard-working, dedicated, accomplished soldier, somebody they'd be proud of.
No. There is a great latitude between admiration for Hitler and serving in the German army.
So you were fighting not for the Nazis, but for Germany?
Sure.
Even though Germany was controlled by the Nazis?
Yeah.
There's a difference.
There is a difference.
It's a thin distinction, but not an uncommon one. In numerous cases Bryan Rigg documented, German officers knew full well that their men were Jewish or partially Jewish, and did nothing about it.
There's many men have said to me, I went to my commander, I told him I was half Jewish, and the commander said, hey, don't do too much, don't do too little, and you're safe by me. You're protected. I could care less about your ancestry. For me, you're a German soldier, you're a loyal comrade, and that's all I care about.
So the U.S. military wasn't the first place to come up with a don't ask, don't tell policy.
That's correct, yeah.
Consider the extraordinary story of Nehemiah Verman. A Polish Jew, he was sent to a labor camp in 1944. His father was executed there. Verman managed to escape, once from the labor camp and again from the German military police that arrested him days later. He ran east, hoping to find the Russian army on the other side of the front.
So finally, I came to a place, a burned-down village. I saw Germans, German soldiers. If I will escape, they will see somebody running away, they could kill me.
Instead, he walked straight into the camp. And by the end of the day, Verman had become Marion Schmidt, assistant chef for the German 72nd Infantry Battalion. At night, he bunked with a supply officer who gave him better food than the soldiers were eating and who soon decided his new chef should look the part.
He took me in and he gave me a German uniform, completely, with a swastika, with a belt, with like a German soldier, with a hat, with boots. I looked in the mirror, I said, how could a Jewish boy look, wearing an uniform from the beasts?
You were wearing the uniform of the army that had killed your father?
That's correct.
Your mother?
Yes.
And you were thinking, I'm lucky to have it.
I was lucky to have the uniform, but I was lucky that I'm alive.
One night, the supply officer called Verman over.
He said to me, Marion, you're a Jew? I didn't answer him. He said, I know exactly that you're Jewish, but don't be afraid. So long where I live, you live. I didn't open my mouth to say yes or no, nothing.
Because you're still not sure that if you say yes...
maybe he's going to shoot me. But nothing happened, and I went back to sleep.
Nehemiah Verman, a Jew, had survived discovery. He was actually a lot better off than many of the so-called Mischlinge back in Germany, because the war had begun to turn on Adolf Hitler, and he'd already begun turning on them.